Strap yourselves in for this one, folks, because today we are diving deep into a story of alleged corruption that's sending shockwaves through the Guyana police force. If you've been keeping up with the news out of Guyana at all, the name Assistant Commissioner of Police Calvin Brutus probably rings a bell.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
He was like this rising star, someone a lot of folks thought was on the fast track to, maybe even leading the entire force someday. And now,
Well, he's staring down a mountain of charges, and the Attorney General saying this whole thing, this case, could have repercussions way beyond Guyana, impacting the entire Caribbean.
it's wild, isn't it? What's really got people talking, though, is the sheer amount of money involved. We're talking about a staggering 800 million Guyana dollars. Just to put that into perspective, that's roughly $4 million US dollars. And get this, SOCU, that's the Special Organized Crime Unit, they're claiming that a good chunk of that, like 500 million, can be traced back to accounts connected to Brutus, his wife, and wait for it, their toddler son. Hold on, their toddler son. Seriously. Okay, we got to break this down. What exactly are they accusing Brutus of doing?
Well, SOCU is recommending a mind-blowing 240 charges. Most of those are centered around money laundering. Essentially, they're saying they believe he was trying to, scrub the dirt off some illegally obtained funds, make it look legit. From what we can tell, SOCU's been meticulously building their case. And judging by the Attorney General's statements, they seem pretty darn confident they've got the goods to move forward.
So what's Brutus's take on all of this?
Yeah.
Is he just taking these accusations lying down, or is he pushing back?
Oh, he's fighting back, all right. He's filed a constitutional motion. It's basically a legal challenge, right? He's saying the whole investigation is tainted, unfair, and should be thrown out. It definitely adds a whole other layer of intrigue to the whole saga.
For sure, for sure.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder about his motives and whether there's any substance to his claims. But it sounds like the Attorney General is pretty convinced those charges are going to stick, no matter what.
Yeah, that seems to be the vibe. Attorney General Anil Nandlall has been pretty vocal about his certainty, He's publicly stated that those charges are coming down the pipeline any day now, and that Brutus will be out of a job the second they're filed. One of his statements really jumped out at me. He said, and I quote, "Mr. Brutus will go down in history as perhaps the highest-ranking officer of the Guyana police force to be implicated in this volume of fraud."
Wow, that's a pretty bold statement.
No kidding.
It sounds like he's laying down the law, making it clear this kind of behavior won't fly. Before we dive into the bigger picture implications here, you mentioned earlier that Brutus was like a rising star in the Guyana police force. Can you fill us in a bit on his background, how he climbed the ranks and ended up in this precarious position?
Sure, yeah. Brutus had built up a pretty solid reputation, He was seen as a capable, promising officer. Some folks even thought he was on track to become the top dog, the head honcho of the entire force someday, which honestly makes this whole situation even more baffling, right?
Absolutely.
It makes you wonder what could possibly drive someone with so much potential to risk it all like this.
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Was it ambition, greed, something else entirely? We might never have all the answers. But this situation definitely raises some big, important questions about the Guyana police force as a whole,
Yeah.
about its inner workings.
No doubt about it. Regardless of how this whole thing shakes out, it shines a light on the potential for corruption, even at the highest levels of law enforcement.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really crucial point. What does this case tell us about the state of law enforcement in Guyana? Is this just an isolated incident, a bad apple? Or is it symptomatic of a deeper, more systemic problem?
That's the question, isn't it? If accusations this serious can be leveled against someone in Brutus's position, what does that say about the systems, the safeguards that are supposed to be in place to prevent corruption? Are those checks and balances robust enough? Or are there cracks, weaknesses that need to be addressed?
These are questions that go way beyond Brutus himself, right? This case has the potential to shake the public's trust in the entire police force.
Oh, absolutely. If these allegations turn out to be true, it could seriously erode the public's faith in law enforcement and raise serious doubts about the integrity of the whole system. This is a situation that demands transparency and accountability, that's for sure.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. But before we move on, I want to circle back to something the Attorney General said about this case potentially being the first of its kind in the Caribbean. He said, I'm quoting here, "I believe he will go down in the Caribbean as an officer of such rank to be implicated in this level of criminality." That's a pretty heavy statement, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no kidding.
It almost suggests that this case could set a precedent, not just in Guyana, but for the whole region.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how other law enforcement agencies across the Caribbean are tackling corruption within their ranks. Do they have effective systems for detection, investigation, and prosecution, or are there systemic weaknesses that need urgent attention? These are all questions that need answers.
Big questions. And questions we'll be exploring further in our next deep dive. So make sure you tune in for part 2 of this captivating case, where we'll delve deeper into the potential ramifications and what this all means for the future of law enforcement in Guyana and beyond.
It's going to be a good one, that's for sure.
All right, until next time, folks, stay curious, stay informed.
And stay tuned. You know, this case really underscores the need for transparency and accountability within law enforcement, not just to maintain public trust, but also to ensure that, justice is served.
It really does make you think. What steps could be taken, concretely, to bolster the system and prevent something like this from happening again? Like, if this really is exposing vulnerabilities, where do we even begin to address them?
Well, I think a multifaceted approach is key here. First and foremost, you got to have strong internal controls and oversight. Things like, stricter financial disclosure rules for officers, regular audits, and independent investigations anytime allegations of corruption surface.
That makes sense. But I imagine internal measures alone probably aren't going to cut it, are they?
No, you're absolutely right. External accountability is just as crucial. We're talking about potentially giving more teeth to independent oversight bodies, making it easier for folks to report wrongdoing, and fostering a culture where citizens feel safe speaking out without fear of, facing backlash.
Those are some solid ideas. But I got to imagine pushing through those changes would likely face some resistance. Systems can be pretty resistant to change, especially there are folks who benefit from the status quo.
Oh, for sure. There's always going to push back. But you got to weigh that against the potential benefits of having a more transparent and accountable police force. I mean, we're talking about restoring public trust, ensuring justice is served, upholding the rule of law. Those benefits far outweigh any perceived costs, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. At the end of the day, that's what matters most. This whole situation, it's like a crossroads for the Guyana police force. It could be a catalyst for some serious introspection and reform. But if it's mishandled, well, it could further erode public trust, which is the last thing anyone wants.
Couldn't agree more. It's a pivotal moment, that's for sure. And it's not just about the Guyana police force either. Think about the ripple effects this could have on the entire justice system. The legal and political landscape could be significantly impacted by how this whole thing unfolds.
No doubt. The outcome of this case, the actions taken by the authorities, it's all going to be under a microscope. People are watching both inside and outside of Guyana. This story is far from over.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It'll be fascinating to see how things play out in the coming weeks and months. What kind of lasting impact will this have on the fight against corruption in Guyana, in the Caribbean as a whole? These are questions we'll all be grappling with, I think.
This whole case, it's like a stark reminder. A reminder that corruption can take root even within the very institutions we depend on to uphold the law.
It's unsettling, for sure.
To say the least.
But it also highlights how vital vigilance is. Accountability, a commitment to ethical standards. And that goes for all levels of society, not just law enforcement. We've got to hold each other accountable.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground today. But before we go any further, I want to make one thing crystal clear. Everything we've talked about, it's all based on allegations. Nothing has been proven in court.
Right, exactly.
We got to let due process run its course.
No.
Avoid jumping to conclusions.
Innocent until proven guilty, right?
Precisely. But even with that in mind, these allegations against Brutus have sparked a much-needed conversation. A conversation about corruption, accountability, the future of law enforcement in Guyana.
A conversation that hopefully leads to real, tangible reforms. Reforms that strengthen the institutions responsible for upholding the law and protecting the rights of all citizens.
Absolutely. That should be the ultimate goal. And it's a conversation that needs to continue. We'll definitely be following it closely. This case, it's like a magnifying glass. It's zooming in on the Guyana police force and raising all sorts of questions about its internal workings, its culture.
That's a great analogy. And when you look closely, you see a few key themes emerge. The power dynamics within the police force, that's a big one. I mean, if someone as high-ranking as Brutus can be accused of these kinds of crimes, what does that say about the system's ability to police itself?
Right. It makes you wonder if there's a culture of impunity, especially among the higher-ups.
Yeah. And then there's the issue of transparency. How much information is actually shared about internal investigations? How can the public be confident that accusations of corruption are being investigated thoroughly and fairly?
It all boils down to trust, doesn't it? The public has to have faith that the police force is actively rooting out corruption, holding its members to the highest standards. If that trust erodes, well, things can go downhill pretty quickly.
Oh, for sure. And that brings us to another crucial aspect, prevention. What measures are in place to discourage officers from engaging in corrupt activities in the first place? Is there adequate training on ethics and professional conduct? Are the consequences for misconduct serious enough to act as a deterrent?
It seems like those are all questions that the Guyana police force and maybe other law enforcement agencies across the region really need to grapple with. This case is a wake-up call in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. This is like a real chance for some serious reflection and reform, to take a hard look in the mirror, see what needs fixing, and put those safeguards in place. Make sure something like this doesn't happen again.
And it's not just about, stamping out corruption. It's about making sure the public, everyday people, feel confident in the police force's ability to, well, do their jobs, to serve and protect. That trust, I think, is paramount.
Absolutely. It's the foundation of effective law enforcement. If that trust crumbles, it makes the police's job that much harder, and it creates this climate of, fear and suspicion. Nobody wins in that scenario.
Right. So bringing it back to our main question, what does this whole Brutus case tell us about the state of law enforcement in Guyana? It feels like there's a lot to unpack, good and bad.
I think that's a fair assessment. There are definitely areas that could use some improvement, for sure, especially when it comes to, transparency, accountability, preventing this kind of thing from happening in the first place. But, it's crucial to remember that this is just one case, one instance. It doesn't necessarily paint a picture of the entire police force. It's easy to, make sweeping judgments. But For sure. And we can't lose sight of the fact that the case against Brutus is still in progress. He hasn't been found guilty of anything yet. He deserves a fair trial, just like anyone else.
Absolutely. Due process is crucial.
But even with that in mind, these allegations have brought to light some really important questions that demand answers. This deep dive, I think, has given us a lot to chew on in terms of the challenges facing law enforcement in Guyana and, potential solutions, ways to address those challenges. Couldn't agree more. And I hope this conversation extends beyond just us, This is something that impacts all of us. Citizens, community members, anyone who cares about a just and equitable society, we all have a role to play here.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. To our listeners, we encourage you to keep learning about this issue. Stay informed, engage in those thoughtful discussions about how we can work together towards a more transparent and accountable system of law enforcement.
Because, at the end of the day, a just and safe society needs a police force that is worthy of our trust and respect. That's what we should all be striving for.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's all the time we have for today, folks. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.